The Ukrainian armed forces seized an incredible opportunity for the first time since the beginning of the war, with internal unrest in Russia and Wagner's refusal to fight, and Moscow's problems with military refueling troops on the Ukrainian front lines. Ukrainians continue to crush the Donetsk region. At the moment, Bakhmut is at risk from the front lines that the Russians most care about. The Ukrainians hold the last line of defense at Kaliska. After dismantling the soldiers of the Russian Air Deployment Force, the attack operations continued simultaneously. Violent clashes are still ongoing in Baku, Ivka, Kurdyumov, and Pereskovia. But the focus of the Ukrainians at this time was to completely seize the settlement of Kazivka and surround Bakhmut from the southwest. Therefore, in line with Kiev's major retaliatory plans, the Ukrainian armed forces began artillery attacks to completely seize Khrushchevka. At the moment, 11 after the soldiers of the Russian air downloads were completely evacuated from the city. There are only 72 of the Russians here. There was a motorcycle. The Russian army, which held the last line of defense, could not withstand the HIMARS artillery attacks by the Ukrainians, both due to the lack of communication and lack of military resources in the city. After the artillery attacks, the Russians were evacuated from the northern neighborhoods of the city. Denis Yaroslavsky that the Ukrainian forces controlled Khrushchevka and also Bakhmut from the air as a result of the attack operations in Kleshchev, which was also supported by the Ukrainian Air Force. The Ukrainians managed to wave blue-yellow flags in this city. The Ukrainian armed forces actually took control of Khrushchevka. Ukrainian defenders have ensured full air control over the city. The 57th of the Ukrainian armed forces carried out attacks on Khrushchevka on behalf of Kiev. The storm continued to push the Russians north of the city. The town of Bakhmut is located in the north of Khrushchevka. Thus, while the Russians fled north of Khrushchevka, they were actually under crossfire at the southern front lines of Bakhmut. The Ukrainian forces were prepared to attack, targeting Russian troops fleeing Khrushchevka in this critical area. The clashes continued for a long time. The Air Force of the Ukrainian Army at Bakhmut provided air support to clashes in the strategic area between Khrushchevka and Bakhmut. As the Russian troops in this clash area failed desperately to leave Khrushchevka, they were also subjected to artillery attacks from the south of Bakhmut and successful shootings by the Ukrainian Air Force. In addition to capturing Khrushchevka, the Ukrainians crowned its victory by destroying a large Russian army. Currently, there are 72 Russian attack units, including the motorized brigade. Kleshchevo has almost no troops left. It was under the control of the Ukrainians. But Kiev's rebel plans are, of course, not limited to Khrushchevka. The city of Bakhmut, which is of serious importance to both sides of the war, is also one of the front lines that Kiev seeks to liberate, especially after taking Kaliska back. The Ukrainians formed an open offensive corridor south of Bakhmut because the northern direction of Bakhmut was under Ukrainian rule. The Russians were stuck in the corner. Beryshivka is located in the north of Bakhmut. The Ukrainian army continues to direct its troops here to attack Bakhmut. Bakhmut has now been completely captured from both the south and the north. The Ukrainians are attacking this city from both sides, pressing the Russians towards the central front lines of Bakhmut. So what are the chances of Bakhmut now after the Russians lost Khrushchevka? I would like to remind you before continuing with our video, if you oppose the invasion of Ukraine and want to support the work we do with my team, you can like our video by commenting and pressing the super thanks button below. Due to recent problems between Russian leader Vladimir Putin and Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin, Wagner mercenaries refused to fight in Bakhmut. So the Russians are currently inadequate to the Ukrainians in terms of military support for Bakhmut. Kiev is aware that the Russian military is inadequate in the city of Bakhmut. Therefore, after the capture of Shuka, the Ukrainian assault officers headed directly to the war castle. Ukraine wants to overthrow the last coup by seizing Bakhmut. Vladimir Putin is desperate. If Russia completely loses control of Bakhmut, the course of the war will change a lot. The Ukrainian forces are continuing to surround Bakhmut with gratitude for this. The Ukrainian Air Force continuously carries out countless types of operations in the city's airspace in the city of Bakhmut, which is of great importance to Russian leader Vladimir Putin. The troops of Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov are being used instead of Wagner forces. But the Chechen troops that Moscow plans to use in Bakhmut seem insufficient against the Ukrainian forces. Ukrainians are far more populated than Russians in Bakhmut. The total number of Chechen fighters is estimated to be less than 30,000. The principal camp of the Chechen troops is Mariupol and its surroundings. But Russia's continuous evacuation of Chechen troops from Mariupol to Bakhmut is also quite risky. The reason is that on the critical route between Mariupol and Bakhmut, dozens of Ukrainian troops are waiting, ready to attack. Kiev knows that Moscow uses this connection route as a military delivery line. In fact, Russia, along with its Chechen troops, must redirect its mercenary troops from the Wagner Group, which refused to fight after the uprising, back to Bakhmut. But after their withdrawal from Bakhmut, Wagner's forces were either relocated to Krasnodar in Russia or camped behind the front lines in the eastern regions of Ukraine, in Donetsk and Luhansk. Wagner forces, located in areas on the Luhansk-Russian border, are already among the groups responsible for the uprising against Putin. At the moment, it seems unlikely that Russia will use Wagner forces again on the Ukrainian front lines. The uprising in Russia has ended, but its effects continue. The leader of Vladimir Putin declared Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin a traitor and described the uprising initiated by Wagner forces as a knife thrown into Russia's back. Nevertheless, as a result of the uprising, Prigozhin announced an agreement which was mediated by Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko and granted him immunity in Belarus. Wagner argued that his decision to accept this was due to his desire to avoid further clashes and civil war. If we consider that the Wagner Group has 25,000 troops, we can actually say that Russia has recovered from a very critical situation. This number could mean 10,000 soldiers. The rest is logistic. With these troops, Wagner forces could occupy much of Moscow. Although the uprising ended and Prigozhin was deported to Belarus, it's believed that Wagner's construction continues. The independent Russian news service Verka reported that a 24,000 square kilometer training base for Wagner was under construction in Osipovichi, Belarus, 200 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Kramarik said it was unlikely that Putin would let Prigozhin live. But in a second speech to the Russian people, Putin left the door open for Wagner mercenaries to join the armed forces. This approach is a sign of how much the Russian leader needs trained and experienced staff. Meanwhile, Ukrainian officials have met the cross-border, short-lived uprising with caution and hope as Kiev forces continue to examine Russian defense for weaknesses and reclaim occupied territories. Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Anna Maliar said Ukraine's counterattack saved 130 kilometers squared by June 26 and gained 17 mi compared to a week ago. Maliar also noted that Ukraine has also launched new attacks in Orikov, Vasilivka, Bodanivka, Yagodny, Kazivka and Kuranivka in the north and south of Bakhmut, reinforcing a siege that began in mid-May. The official also added that Ukrainian troops are advancing 1 to 2 kilometers along these new axes. In summary, this difficult situation in Russia has paved the ground for the successful progress of the large-scale missile operations planned by the Ukrainian armed forces. In addition, the Russians lost their territories under occupation as well as their prestige. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, are expected to continue their offensive operations in this way after catching the pace. Kiev's next goal, after fully liberating the city of Bakhmut, is expected to turn its focus back to the southern front lines and eventually reclaim Crimea. Nothing is going well in Russia, which invaded Ukraine. There have been one explosion after another in Russia in the last week. The country has turned into hell. Putin is having the hardest days of his life. So what exactly is happening in Russia? The chaos in Russia is not new. Putin has been suppressing all tensions in Russia for years, but at the moment of this crisis, all tensions resurfaced. Russia is going through one of the worst periods in its history. Vladimir Putin, Russia's leader, has ruled the country since 1999. During this time, he has faced many problems. In recent years, Putin has stepped up the crackdown on his opponents and has made all democratic institutions in the country unworkable. Corruption allegations in Russia are not being investigated, and Russian citizens are on the verge of revolt. The Russian Federation is also in danger of disintegrating. The other danger that awaits Russia is a massive bankruptcy due to the economic crisis in the country. These great dangers triggered the current crisis in Russia. But what does the fact that a bomb explodes every day in Russia have to do with these crises? Unable to deal with the major crisis in Russia, Putin started a war to regain his power and keep his country together. He thought that this war would make everyone support him more. He increased his security rhetoric and decided to invade Ukraine before inviting Ukraine. Russia was confident of a great success in this war. The Russian army, one of the largest in the world, planned to capture Kiev. Thanks to this victory, Russian leader Putin imagined that he would be recognized as a hero by his people. But nothing went Putin's way. Ukraine's leader, Zelensky, showed great courage and decided to resist Russia. Ukraine did not surrender and showed a historic resistance. Ukrainian leader Zelensky also encouraged his people and army with his courageous speeches. Zelensky is a former comedian. He knows how to charm the masses and raise their hopes. In 2018, Zelensky entered politics by taking off his stage clothes and putting on a dress in order to develop Ukraine. The fact that Ukraine is a Western and developed country scared Putin because the Russian people were closely following the developments in Ukraine and everyone started to admire Zelensky. The number of people who wanted democracy in Russia was increasing day by day. By invading Ukraine, Putin wanted to show that he would not allow a Western state on his border. This time, however, Zelensky took off his suit and appeared in front of the cameras in military fatigues. Zelensky, who won the love of the Ukrainian people as a comedian, turned into a national hero in the eyes of the people by choosing to resist Russia. Zelensky has already gone down in Ukrainian history. The Ukrainian leader, Zelensky's decision to resist has thwarted all Kremlin plans. The Kremlin administration thought that Ukraine would be easily captured. However, thanks to Zelensky's decisive stance, the Ukrainian army showed a legendary resistance and stopped the Russian army near the Dnipro River. Shortly after the Ukrainian army stopped the Russian troops, it began counter-operations. During these operations, the Russian army suffered so many casualties that it will go down in world history. The Russian army lost about 100,000 soldiers in this war. The Russian army also lost a lot of tanks, airplanes, and stocks. The Russian army was forced to retreat from most of the territories it occupied. The Russian army, which was thought to be the strongest army in the world, turned out to be a very weak army. Russia's reputation is completely ruined. A military base in the Russian-occupied city of Mariupol was shelled by the Ukrainian army today. The base is said to have been badly damaged as a result of this attack. Russia may have to withdraw from this region very soon. There are also been successive explosions in Crimea today. Crimea, occupied by Russia in 2014, is waiting for the day when it will be liberated. The Ukrainian army is doing its best to liberate Crimea. Russia has already started digging trenches in Crimea. This war started in Crimea. It will end in Crimea, said Ukrainian leader Zelensky after Zelensky's statement. Everyone understood how eager the Ukrainian army is to liberate Crimea. But the biggest explosion today was in Moscow. A fire broke out around 6 o'clock local time at Mega Khimki, the largest shopping center in Russia, located in the Russian capital, Moscow. After the fire, explosions started, one after another. The shopping center continued to burn for hours. However, the cause of the fire is not yet known. There are two different claims in the Russian press. The first claim is that this attack is the result of a power struggle between oligarchs in Russia. It is claimed that there was a power struggle between the companies that own this burning shopping mall in Russia. Competition is increasing among all capital groups in Russia. These groups aim to increase their political power because it is thought that Putin's rule will end in a short time. Therefore, all oligarchs are struggling to gain more power after Putin. The second claim about this explosion is that the fire was set by Ukrainian intelligence. However, there is no concrete evidence for this claim. The Russian government does not want it to be said that this fire was set by Ukrainian intelligence because this reveals the intelligence weakness in Russia. In the last few days, there have been explosions at a fuel tanker and a military airport in Russia. The Russian government has not yet explained why. However, many media outlets reported that these explosions could have been caused by Ukrainian drones. Every day there is a new explosion in Russia. As a result of these explosions, Russian citizens are experiencing great fear. Russia has turned into hell. Russian citizens blame Putin's government for these attacks. Putin's government has failed to prevent any of these attacks. Russian citizens are outraged by this failure of the government. This war did not solve any of Russia's problems. On the contrary, it has caused so many new problems. Citizens living in Russia are now trying to protect their lives. Moreover, inflation in Russia has reached historic sea levels. The Russian ruble continues to depreciate every day. The Russian stock market is experiencing a huge decline as a result of all this. Many companies are going bankrupt. Unemployment in Russia is increasing every day. The Russian people live in poverty and war by inflicting such misery on his own people. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is making the whole world suffer. All peaceful states are worried about Putin's aggressive policies. An oppressive leader who started a war to consolidate his power turned the lives of millions of people into a nightmare. This is a very important example for world history. No society that wants to live in peace should allow oppressive leaders who put their own political career above all else to rule in Russia. Millions of people fear for their lives because of Putin's mistakes, but the Ukrainian government says it will never harm any civilian. The fact that there were no civilian casualties in these explosions in recent days and that the explosion in the shopping mall took place during closed hours makes everyone think it is thought that these explosions may have been organized by the Ukrainian army. This raises the same question on everyone's mind. Will the explosions continue in Russia? We have no concrete date on this at the moment. The Ukrainian army does not claim responsibility for these explosions in Russia. That's why there are no official statements about the fires. But the fact remains that if this war continues, there could be dozens more explosions in Moscow. The day there is a lot of good news from the Obama direction here. Ukrainians leveraged their newly gained territories on Bakhmut's northern flank and increased the scale of the operation even more after Ukrainians saw how Russian troops from the 9th Motorized Rifle Brigade started to abandon their positions. It was decided to maintain the momentum and push along the lake due to the problems with communication. Some Russian detachments did not understand what was going on and still defended their trenches in front of the home of a road, even though they were already virtually surrounded. Ukrainians reinforced this region with mortar crews and unleashed devastating fire on the Romanian Russian troops due to the density of the coverage of this isolated strongpoints. Russian soldiers were quickly eliminated and the home of a road was completely unblocked. After a quick regrouping, Ukrainians opened two lines of attack north of the lake and south of the lake. When it comes to the northern attack, Ukrainians rolled out their tank and undermined the Russian defense with rapid fire, while an armored fighting vehicle brought the Ukrainian assault unit closer to the enemy positions. As a result, Russian troops were eliminated and the positions became under Ukrainian control. When it comes to the sudden attack, Ukrainians almost reached the settlement of Barayevo with little resistance. Several hours later, Russian forces attempted to make a counterattack and used two trucks to deliver several assault units to the tree line. However, Ukrainians immediately responded with artillery fire, and Russian soldiers ran away before the Ukrainians even managed to correct their fire, so they didn't incur any losses. Later, the Russian Ministry of Defense published a situational report and claimed that during the previous day, Ukrainians conducted 25 attacks in the Bakhmut direction, engaging up to 3 battalions. They claimed that all attacks were repelled. However, Russian forces still conducted a tactical retreat to better positions. In the evening, the head of the Wagner Group, Prigozhin, said that the Russian Ministry of Defense lied, and in reality, Ukrainians penetrated Russian defenses by multiple kilometers because their troops abandoned their positions, and that Ukrainians not only completely unblocked the main supply line, but also established control over the tactical heights. If you look at the topographic map, we can see that this is true. And now Ukrainians control positions that are more than 50 meters higher than Russian positions in Brevika and Bakhmut. And since attacking the lowlands is much easier, Ukrainians threaten to cut Bakhmut from the north in the near future. Prigozhin also reported that his forces advanced by around 100 meters in their area of responsibility. Ukrainian spokesman for the Eastern Group of Forces reported that over the last 3 days of active counterattacks, Ukrainians had freed 17.3 kilometers squared of the ground, excluding today's significant advances. Several hours ago, a fighter from the famous 93rd Mechanized Brigade reported that one of their rifle battalions had reinforced the home of origin, which clearly indicates further development of the counter-encirclement operation.